Okay, we're going to talk at some students' request about assignment 5, in particular how to develop the very last data table, which called for you to be able to do a data table which all at once looked at scenarios 1 and scenario 3 as annual growth changes in revenue occurred from 0 up to 15%, and what the various equity values would be in those situations. And first of all, the reason for wanting to do that is if you look at the decisions that the owners are facing, the owners of Bubble and Bubble are facing, is they want to know what will maximize our equity. And of course the answer, the value of our equity in a few years, and of course the answer to that changes as their revenue growth percentage changes, but it also will be impacted whether they decide for a scenario where they incur higher rent in order to facilitate their growth, or borrowing money for a building and paying interest on a loan for that. So we're going to look at this, and we'll look at data tables, but we'll also be looking at a choose function. There may be other ways to go about this. You may have a better way. We'd love for you to share it on the discussion page of ELC. The other reason for attacking it in this way, certainly going from scenario 1 to scenario 3 and back, you can do what you've been doing so far this term, which is you can go in and change about 6 or 7 different inputs and toggle from one to the other. So you know we have to change the rent, we have to change the capital expenditures because we're buying a building, and so forth. Pay no attention, we're in a raging thunderstorm here. So you've got to go and change those. Not a big deal, particularly not in hopefully in the comfort of your home or after hours in your office, since you have so much free time. But what's likely to happen if you get into more sophisticated modeling is that you'll have to change these quickly. You'll have to change them on the fly. You may be under pressure, and by doing it the way I'm going to show you how to do it, using the choose functions and these different scenarios, you don't have to worry so much about missing one of the items, and you can have things automated. So you can be in a meeting and change from scenario to scenario, or you can create the data table that we're going to create without having to go manually change it bit by bit. So I want to start by taking you to scenario 3. This may look familiar, or there may be a couple of changes here. And so here's the balance sheet, income statement, and so forth. So a couple of key items. I don't remember what we had for owner draw. In this version of scenario 3, I've got 2 draws at the end of the last couple of years. I've also modified it so we're just going to talk about revenue growth here, and in scenario 1 as well. So even though these are vestiges here from, by the way, this is Troy's model, I'm using it without permission, but at least with attribution. But I've redesigned this or changed it so that unit growth and unit demand are irrelevant. Again, there were reasons for wanting to go back and forth between that so far in the course, but for right now, we just want to know revenue percent changes. So let's anchor ourselves, if you will, and to make sure that we've got some metrics right, or that at least we're consistent, so we can see if we change things and get things wrong, we'll have a way to get back to where we started. And of course, saving these often and saving them as different models as you go forward, or in different files as you go on, is always helpful in case you just blow up the model or really screw up or black out or something like that during your during your formulation of the model. So a couple of things. Cash, particularly cash in year 3, tends to be an item that you'll notice a change in. You might end up making a mistake in the model, and maybe EBITDA for a year or EBIT for a year or two still works out. But if that cash at the end of the day is 517, 638, we probably haven't messed things up, or if we did, we've consistently messed them up as to where we were before. Another item, 15% revenue growth, ends up with revenue at 2701 at the end, 2.7 million. And of course, we could check that with our calculator or elsewhere by simply looking to see if this going up by 15%, the 1776 actually turned into 2701 in 3 years at a 15% compound annual growth. We'll look at EBITDA as well, maybe 569, 625 in that out year, again with 15% growth. So, and then you'll see here the value to shareholders calculation, which was an enterprise value minus the debt outstanding plus excess cash, 467. Remember, we had 517 of cash, but I told you that $50,000 of that was not excess, so we couldn't use it here. So we can look and say that if we're in scenario 3, and that we grow at 15% a year, and any of these other assumptions, that we'll end up with a value to the shareholders, that's using a 100% number, of $4,129,000. So we can also remember that as one of our metrics. And by the way, we did have owner draws of 175 here. In case that's throwing some of you off from your numbers, you may not have had quite the same numbers. So here's the data table that we're trying to get to. Haven't formatted it particularly beautifully, particularly well. Probably should put 1 here and a 3 here for scenarios. In fact, I'll do that now, just so we'll be in numerical order. Now, of course, the table is wrong or has to be changed. But again, the idea is, what's our equity value under scenario 1 or scenario 3 as we go from scenario 1 to scenario 3, and as we go from compound annual growth in revenue from 0 up to 15%. And looking again, scenario 3, and with a 15% growth, in fact, we do see that we end up with this 4129. So evidently, before we started recording, I must have done this right, or at least consistently wrong. So this is the data table we're striving for. Now, how do we get there? Again, the less artful way and the more time-consuming way as you go forward is every time you're told the scenario changes, to go back and change everything that changes from scenario 1 to scenario 3, and then just plug these in. And again, that's probably faster in getting you to a table like this because there's less investment up front. But what happens if, after you've done all this and filled this table in, I'll call it manually, doing one at a time, what happens if some other assumption changes? Maybe the owner drawn numbers are going to change. Maybe a margin is going to change somewhere. It makes all those numbers wrong. And so what I'm trying to get you to do is to invest the time up front to be able to do something like this so that you don't have to recreate these manually. You'll see in the final project that something like this will be helpful as well, and it's certainly helpful in assignment 5, and of course you'll be graded more highly if you've got a little more elegant solution. So how do we segue back from one scenario to the other? Well, I'll assume that you've looked at the breaking into Wall Street information about choose, and it was in refresh your memories. It was in excellence with Excel, not in the financial modeling part. It was under formula lookup, and then it was number 10 under scenario. And they talked about the choose and the lookup function and the scenario manager. For our purposes, we're going to use choose. If you find that scenario manager makes more sense for you, then that'd be fine as well. So I'm going to stop this and go to part 2 in the next video.